Well, hi everybody, good afternoon. I'm Heidi Bostic, Dean of the College of Liberal Arts, and it's really my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, the 2017 recipient of the Lindberg Award. Now you may know the Lindberg is the highest faculty award given within the College of Liberal Arts. It recognizes each year one truly outstanding scholar and teacher, and I'm gratified today to publicly acknowledge Dr. Helen Fitzpatrick, Professor of History, as that outstanding scholar and teacher. Let me just take 1 minute to forecast next year our 2018 winner of the Lindberg Award, Dr. Paula Salvio, Chair and Professor of Education. Paula is here, so let's acknowledge her too. Professor Fitzpatrick has served the University of New Hampshire for 20 years, having had the wisdom to leave the faculty of Harvard to join our ranks. She's an extraordinary teacher who is as adept at leading first-year discovery courses as she is PhD seminars. And she was just sharing with me that this semester she may have her best class ever. Isn't that a joy? She's also an extraordinary scholar, authoring or editing 9 books, count them 9, and you know history books are not fast to write, are they, Ellen? In the area of modern American political and intellectual history. Her most recent books reach beyond academic audiences. The Highest Glass Ceiling, Women's Quest for the American Presidency, was excerpted in The New Yorker, selected as editor's choice by the New York Times, and named a notable nonfiction book of 2016 by the Washington Post. Her previous book was a New York Times bestseller, Letters to Jackie, Condolences from a Grieving Nation, which became the basis of a highly regarded documentary film that Professor Fitzpatrick Associate produced, and for which she spent a good deal of time reflecting on the presidency of a central figure in today's talk, John F. Kennedy. The broad appeal of her books, together with her frequent appearances in the New York Times, Washington Post, Boston Globe, and on NPR and PBS's The NewsHour, not to mention you can hardly turn on the TV without seeing her, among other outlets, have positioned Professor Fitzpatrick as a highly respected public intellectual. I have to add that the original title of today's talk was My Love Affair with John F. Kennedy. But in light of recent events, we kind of got a little cold feet on that sort of spicy title, didn't we, Ellen? So, for her outstanding work, Professor Fitzpatrick has been recognized with the Lindberg Award and invited here to speak with us today. Her talk is ultimately entitled History Lived and Learned, a Coming-of-Age Story. Please join me in welcoming her to the podium.
Thank you. Thank you, Heidi. Well, the Dean well anticipates my little prologue here. Thank you very much for this kind introduction, and also for the willingness of all of you to spend a little time with me this afternoon. I was very touched when Dean Bostic called me last spring to tell me that I had received the Lindberg Award. I've been teaching for a long time, and as the years went by, I came to feel that it was foolish to covet such honors, mostly because they may never come one's way. To live a life devoted to teaching, reading, and scholarly pursuits, as we university professors do, is a tremendous privilege in and of itself. I can now attest, however, that it's also awfully nice to have this unanticipated recognition from the College of Liberal Arts, and I thank you very sincerely for it. The Dean explained, as she has just told you, that with the honor, as is so often the case, came responsibility. That is, giving a public lecture on a topic of my choosing for the next, in the next academic year. And as she said, I exclaimed when she called me, I know exactly what my title will be. I'm going to call it My Love Affair with John F. Kennedy. It is to Dean Bostic's credit that she received this information with complete equanimity. And this is why she's a dean and I will never be. My proposed title captured perfectly what I want to talk to you about today, namely how my own coming of age as a person and a historian was deeply influenced by JFK. Through these personal reflections, I hope to convey a more transcendent historical reality. And that is the way in which an American president can not only move a nation, but stir ideals and aspirations that may help to define a generation. It's a fact that I think is well worth remembering these days. Back to my title for a moment. As the day approached when I had to give the official name to this lecture, I began seriously rethinking my title. I hadn't had a real love affair with JFK, of course, unlike most other women on the planet, over the age of 50, or so one might assume from the lore surrounding the 35th president. I knew also from experience that a title can run away from you and take on a new life of its own in a distant domain. And so it was after I published a book on the condolence mail written to his widow after President Kennedy's 1963 assassination. I was driving home one day when I received an excited call from a friend in Texas telling me that a supermarket tabloid was featuring a big write-up on my book. That seemed very improbable, but she insisted it was true. Heart-pounding, what could the story possibly say? I pulled into the very next convenience store that I saw it, and sure enough, there was the National Examiner, a tabloid not quite up to the standards set by the National Enquirer, with its scandalous headline, Jackie Kennedy's Secret Letters. There was nothing, of course, secret about the condolence letters written to Mrs. John F. Kennedy. They had been sitting in the Kennedy Library for nearly a half a century, easily accessible to researchers, but largely overlooked. As I scanned the Examiner story, I felt relief first and foremost that I wasn't being exposed in a nationally distributed tabloid for some horrific historical mistake I had made. Professor Fitzpatrick, fraud. As I read on, I felt sorry for the poor readers who had plunked down $4, only to learn in the big reveal that these were not the former First Lady's personal letters, as they must have assumed from the headline's tease. Instead, they were being treated to some documents gathered in a published work of history, my very own book. Although at the time I had a good laugh at the hilarity of the situation, it stuck in my memory. I'm not the first academic historian to have their work featured in a supermarket tabloid, I'm sure, but it's not exactly the sort of distinction one strives for as a scholar, and it wasn't one that I was eager to repeat. Better rethink the title for the Lindberg Lecture. So here I am with a promise that I can fulfill, some reflections on history lived and learned, a coming-of-age story, which is best told in 3 parts, as stories often are. I'd like to begin by talking a bit about my childhood and how President Kennedy became a figure of significance to me. From there, I'd like to trace briefly how my perspective on JFK shifted within the prism of my graduate training as a historian in the 1970s, and in my years as a young professor of modern American history. Finally, I'd like to say a few words about how I think about JFK today as I look back, which I often do, over my own life and the history that unfolded as I came of age. It is at once a personal story that is, paradoxically, not at all unique to me. It's a history I have lived and learned, along with many in my generation. When I first began teaching in 1980, almost 40 years ago, I often asked my students about the first historical event that they remembered. Most then mentioned Neil Armstrong's 1969 landing on the moon, not because it had taken place that year, I hasten to add. They were 20 years old at that point. As a young professor, I had a didactic purpose, or so I thought, in asking this question. I wanted my students to understand that history wasn't about a stuffy, distant past. It was present and real, and already a part of their lived experience. In retrospect, my question undoubtedly emerged from my own sense that history had been intricately interwoven with my childhood and my family. I grew up in Amherst, Massachusetts, where my father was a professor of agricultural economics at the university, and my mother a mathematics teacher. Amherst was a quiet place in the 1950s, a largely white Anglo-Saxon Protestant redoubt, full of Republicans, living the life of genteel academics among neighboring professionals, farmers, and tradespeople. The town was rich in history. My walk to elementary school took me past the home of Helen Hunt Jackson, a 19th century poet of some renown. I learned much later she wrote one of the first treatises condemning our country for its mistreatment of Native Americans. As a child, I knew her name only from a painted wooden plaque visible on the lovely yellow Victorian house where she was born. In the fall, I dawdled there, picking up horse chestnuts shed by a beautiful tree on that property. I also raided apples with my sister and my brother from the trees behind the house of historian Henry Steele Commager. His name then meant nothing to me. He was just a mean old man, shaking his fists and yelling up at the apple trees where I hid until the coast was clear. As a college student, I would read slashing criticism of the racial insensitivities and Commanger's widely assigned textbook of American history. I should add, I'm glad I stole the apples. Robert Frost was still teaching part-time at Amherst College when I was in grade school. I knew him as the local poet, whose reputation then eclipsed that of Amherst's 19th century daughter, Emily Dickinson. Remarkably, the breadth and depth of Dickinson's work would not be fully recognized until the late 1950s. I didn't know much about Emily Dickinson until long after, but I often cut through lawns shaded by her handsome historic residence on my way home from high school. I glanced daily on my walk to grammar school at a monument to Harlan Fiske Stone, an Amherst native who served as Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court in the 1940s. I read words I didn't really understand about his achievements. He remained just a name in bronze on a massive but fascinating rock near an Amherst College fraternity. I later learned that he supported the internment of Japanese Americans during the Second World War, despite his record as a civil libertarian. To tell you the truth, as a child, the only one of Amherst's august local personages who made much of an impression on me was Uncle Wiggley's father, Howard Garris. Garris and his wife wrote the Uncle Wiggily, Tom Swift, and Bobbsey Twins children's books, which we enjoyed as kids in the 1950s. In 1961, when I was 9, and Garris 8 decades older, the town threw a birthday party for him. Local children were invited to attend. I remember a very old man who looked nothing like Uncle Wiggily, who was, after all, a rabbit, a giant cake, and photographers from Look magazine memorialized the occasion. It was all very exciting. I'm sorry that I'm not in this photograph. Believe me, if I had been, I'd be telling you I was. My family scanned it, but I'm not there. I was present, but out of view of this photo. Amherst was a wonderful place to grow up. My parents chose wisely in settling on a place to raise their family. They had met at the university and were both members of the class of 1943. And here's where my life story intersects with history and ultimately President Kennedy. My father, here on the right, was born in 1917 into a large Irish Catholic family rooted in the Boston area. In fact, there's a genealogical trail I may trace when I retire that indicates that my great-grandfather's niece married a brother of Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, President Kennedy's mother. My mother considered the Fitzpatricks Yankees, because they had arrived in New England relatively early in the 19th century. Martin Callahan, my mother's father, on the other hand, was born in Ireland, and he came to the United States in the early 20th century. My mother's parents worked in the textile mills of New England. Although their own educations had been limited, they had aspirations for their only child, my mother, who's now 96, and she amply fulfilled them. She was one of the very few female mathematics majors in college, and even now she retains a calculator in her brain that functions at warp speed. My parents had grown up during the Great Depression, as had John F. Kennedy, but their experience differed markedly from the future president. When a reporter asked President Kennedy what he remembered of the catastrophic economic collapse that scarred the lives of so many in the 1930s, he replied memorably, "I really didn't learn about the Depression until I read about it at Harvard." His family, he recalled, had, quote, "one of the great fortunes of the world, and it was worth more than ever then. We had bigger houses, more servants, we traveled more." Suffice it to say, my parents knew a lot more about the Great Depression than did Kennedy. This was especially true of my father, who left his family home after graduating from high school to work on a dairy farm in a bleak, remote corner of Vermont. And there he remained until he earned enough to start college in the fall of 1939. The United States' entry into the Second World War in 1941 changed the lives of my mother's and father's generation. Colleges and universities were hardly insulated places. The war came to them even in the small town of Amherst. One by one, or sometimes in small groups, male classmates began to leave the campus. My father enlisted in the Navy, and he too left just after my parents had completed their junior year in college. He went to New York for officers' training at Columbia, and then to Annapolis for 6 months of preparation at the Naval Academy. Before being commissioned and going overseas, my father was permitted to return to Amherst in May of 1943 for his college graduation. As president of his class, he delivered a class day oration to his fellow graduates, their friends and family. And in it, he described, quote, "the complexity of our college experience. We once moved about in a college tranquil and unhurried. We watched our quiet campus quickly change into a war machine. Unlike graduating classes of other years, we have no uncertainty as to our next occupation. We are faced with a difficult task. We fully realize the seriousness of that task. We shall complete that task for the greater good of our world. Described in any terms whatever, the situation waiting for us is simply a matter of fighting for our own lives." At the time my father spoke these words, John F. Kennedy was already in the Navy, a lieutenant junior grade, serving as the commander of a patrol torpedo boat in the Solomon Islands. In fact, as my father prepared to join the war in the summer of 1943, Kennedy's war experience was almost over. Both men, my father and JFK, were 26 years old that summer. On a dark August night, JFK's PT boat was rammed and cut in half by a Japanese destroyer. The valor he displayed in rescuing his crew, set adrift on a burning sea, would earn Kennedy the Navy and Marine Corps Medal. My father was deployed to a battleship, the USS Nevada. After convoy duty in the North Atlantic, his ship sailed towards France for the D-Day invasion. The Nevada bombed the German batteries along the shores of Normandy and Cherbourg, provided support for Allied landing forces, and destroyed targets well inland of the beaches. There is one picture of my father, extant from this period. The blue arrow shows him. He is standing in the hold of the Nevada before a makeshift altar as a Catholic priest said Mass before the invasion. Several months later, after a leave in which he returned home and married my mother, my father headed back to the Nevada for the war in the Pacific and the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. During the latter engagement, the ship was hit by a kamikaze pilot. You can see on this page of the Nevada's cruise book my father's handwritten comments on this battle. He notes, "They talk about the Marines, but if you knew what I know, here is a burnt offering. 3 LCIs went in, 2 were sunk. I saw them. This one came back," he's referring to this photo on the left, "decks red with blood. It was a dry day." When the war ended, the Nevada was preparing to participate in the invasion of the Japanese mainland. My father rarely spoke of these events, but the war never entirely left him, as must have been true of so many World War II veterans. It certainly shaped the lives of both of my parents, and through them, the lives of their children. Decisive choices came soon after the war was over. A box in my father's Navy discharge papers labeled job preference is filled in undecided. I've looked for but haven't found JFK's discharge papers from the Navy. But if they reflected honestly on the future president's thinking at that particular moment in his life, they would be marked similarly. After a period of indecision, Kennedy made a fateful choice for politics, running in 1946 for a seat in the U.S. House from Massachusetts' 11th Congressional District. In my father's case, the discharge papers do contain a bit of foreshadowing. There was another box on the form. It was entitled Preference for Future Training, and that box reads School - Postgraduate Work in Economics. The road ahead was thus revealed, and my father soon was on it. After my father earned an advanced degree, my parents returned to Amherst, where my father took up his teaching post at their alma mater. Children appeared in regular succession. I was the third of what would eventually be 6 little Fitzpatricks. There are 5 of them here, and that's me on the far right. My parents, I later came to understand, had settled into a life pursued by many parents of the baby boom generation. It had its contradictions, as my father anticipated in a letter written home to his parents in the summer of 1944 aboard the Nevada. One of the revelations of this experience, he wrote, is the incongruity of the theories for the world after the war and the mentality of the American people. On the one hand, they picture themselves the saviors of oppressed people. On the other hand, they hate each other for religious, social, and economic differences. Our neighborhood in Amherst was safe, secure, and full of children. Yet as young as we were, our father's war was somehow both unknown and a ghostly presence. I remember poking around with a friend in some old trunks of his dad's in their basement. They were stuffed with grim war souvenirs, guns, and German helmets that his father had collected as an infantryman in the European theater. My brother and sister had a similar experience with the kids next door when they boldly trespassed on some locked file boxes belonging to their father. One was full of ghastly photographs he had taken during the liberation of a concentration camp. The world my parents made was enriched by the presence in our home of my maternal grandmother. She played a central role in our family, and with her stories and her values, she kept evergreen, so to speak, the ties that bound us to our Irish forebears. With 6 children, 2 parents, and 1 grandmother, we weren't the biggest family in Amherst, but we weren't the smallest either. In this context, I felt somewhat self-conscious about being Catholic and sensitive to what I took to be a negative view among some of our religion. I died 1,000 deaths on more than one occasion when a friend's mother called all the children playing outside in for lunch, only to send me home because I could not eat meat on Friday. I can now see that she was just a busy mother with a plate full of hot dogs and a pragmatic problem. But I felt the sting of shame. I also recall my father erupting when I came home one day with a grade school assignment that involved sketching our forebears in a family tree. The teacher asked me what we were, and I didn't know what to say, I told my father. The next time they ask, he replied sharply, tell them you're an American. My family lived comfortably, and we were hardly an embattled minority. Nonetheless, as sometimes happens, the history bred in the bone sometimes made us feel like we were. I hope this long prologue has prepared you to appreciate fully the tremendous enthusiasm with which my parents greeted John F. Kennedy's candidacy for the presidency. The election of 1960 is my first historical memory. I was then 8 years old, and I recall the excitement of this campaign vividly, though of course, with hindsight, and from a child's perspective. My parents were liberal Democrats who could be counted upon to vote the party ticket. But Kennedy was another story. He was more than a native son, our senator from Massachusetts. He belonged to my parents' generation, and his life reflected and affirmed, or so it seemed, many shared experiences. He was Irish and Catholic, a naval officer during the Second World War, from Boston, like my father, excuse me, and exactly my father's age. The fact that he was handsome, had a wonderful sense of humor, a Harvard education, which made me think he was smart until I learned better, a quick wit and clear-eyed intelligence, a wife almost as lovely as my mother, and 2 children almost as adorable as we were, only added to his luster. More importantly, of course, Kennedy held fast to the New Deal values of an activist government committed to protecting labor, the aged, the poor, and to redressing inequality. Those issues mattered to my parents. I knew nothing about them, but nonetheless caught the wave of excitement that seemed to animate the grown-ups. It's hard now to capture in our cynical times how fresh and invigorating JFK's bold quest for the presidency was to so many in 1960. When Kennedy spoke in his inaugural address of the torch being passed to a new generation, he was talking about men and women like himself and my parents who had lived through the Depression, the Second World War, and what I.F. Stone once called the haunted 50s. I would later come to see that it was part of Kennedy's genius that so many generations claimed him. At 43, he became the youngest man elected to the presidency and the first president to be born in the 20th century. He made a striking contrast at his inauguration as he stood next to Dwight Eisenhower, the outgoing president, who looked ancient by comparison. In fact, Eisenhower was then only 70, the age of our current chief executive. My father was no fan of Dwight Eisenhower's, the Supreme Allied commander during World War II. Like Kennedy himself and many a junior officer, he viewed the generals with cynicism. Somehow I came into possession of a Kennedy campaign button during the 1960 race the size of a dinner plate. It said, in reference to Eisenhower's wife, "Start packing, Mamie, the Kennedys are coming." Historians, including myself, often point to the Kennedy-Nixon debates as a liminal moment in the 1960 election, and indeed a landmark in the history of modern presidential politics. I remember them clearly. Television was then in its relative infancy. But in 1960, it brought national politics and JFK himself into our living room. My parents watched the debates, and I watched my parents. They took obvious delight in what they, if not subsequent analysts, considered to be Kennedy's absolute trouncing of Nixon. There was little doubt in our house about who had carried the day. It was, however, an open question in 1960 whether a Roman Catholic could be elected to the presidency. Kennedy confronted the issue adroitly, but he lost votes nonetheless from those who openly admitted they could not countenance a Catholic president. We weren't an excessively religious household, and JFK was a thoroughly secular candidate. That is so much the case that he has been condemned for it for politicians on the religious right today. But bigotry charts its own course, regardless of the facts on display. And in the end, Kennedy squeaked by, of course, in a very close election, much to the delight of the Fitzpatricks, and no thanks to most of the voters in Republican Amherst. Although JFK won the state of Massachusetts in a landslide, Nixon prevailed in our little town with 60% of the votes compared to Kennedy's 39. Kennedy's rise to the presidency felt, in some sense, I think, like a triumph for who we were and all that had been. I remembered the early 1960s as a largely happy time in our family, with a brand new baby in our house, my sister Jean. It was scarred only by my grandmother's death when I was 10. Despite his narrow victory, JFK became an immensely popular president who enjoyed the highest public approval ratings in the history of polling for any president before or since. With Kennedy in the White House, being Irish and Catholic and from a big family was no cause for shame. On the contrary, our humble origins and the strides made by successive generations could be and were celebrated. We shared with the president the taproot of our Irish immigrant ancestors. Of Kennedy's 1,000 days in office, I remember three things especially vividly. JFK's press conferences. Nationally televised, they showed off to great advantage the president's charm, his sense of humor, his wit, and his sure-footed command of the issues. 90% of Americans watched at least one of his first three appearances, and nearly 20 million tuned in over the course of his presidency. And so it was in our family. I can see in my mind's eye my grandmother watching them with amusement. At 10 years old, I had no real understanding of the substance of the issues being discussed, but at least one aspect of them clearly made an impression on me. Kennedy frequently sparred in a gentlemanly way with an outspoken woman reporter named May Craig, who always wore hats to these press gatherings. You can see this look between the two of them here. He called on her often, and she stood out as one of the few female journalists in the fray. She must have inspired me because for a summer art project, I drew an elaborate colored picture depicting Mrs. Craig wearing an outsized hat studded with fruit among an assortment of animals. And at the bottom, I added a caption, "May Craig in the jungle." I also recall the Cuban Missile Crisis for a very specific reason. It pierced the consciousness of this 10-year-old because my best friend's father was an Air Force colonel who worked in a mysterious Strategic Air Command outpost carved in the mountains of the Holyoke Range. In their house was a special red telephone, which we children were instructed not to go near. A prohibition of that kind can only be construed in the mind of a 10-year-old as an invitation. We circled that phone and speculated about it on many occasions. Somehow my childish understanding was that if the phone rang, war was imminent. And thus, in the fall of October of 1962, when I learned that it had rung, at least metaphorically, I rushed home to announce breathlessly to my parents, "Mom, Dad, there's going to be a war." My parents listened, and they took me seriously. They knew that Colonel Merrill shouldered important duties in a high-security military installation. JFK had not yet informed the American people of the peril at hand. But there I was, the canary in the mine shaft, right in our house on Hillcrest Place. Thus did the most dangerous crisis of the Cold War and our nation's closest brush with nuclear Armageddon arrive in our little domain. Not until I was a graduate student would I fully understand Kennedy's complex role in this near catastrophe. I didn't need to plumb the recesses of my imagination, given my childhood memories, to appreciate the stakes. A final childhood recollection of President Kennedy is both more immediate and bittersweet. Its essence is captured in a line of F. Scott Fitzgerald's, "Show me a hero, and I will write you a tragedy." In the fall of 1963, almost 1 year to the day after the peaceful resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy came to my hometown. Amid a crowd of some 10,000, I stood with my best friend, Colonel Merrill's daughter, known to you as Deborah Merrill Sands, Dean of the Paul School, perhaps 10 feet away from Kennedy on a college green. His visit was occasioned by the dedication of the Robert Frost Library at Amherst College. I've often turned over in my mind and even in the archives as I sifted through contemporaneous photographs and documents my many vivid impressions of that Indian summer day. What stands out most vividly is the excitement we felt in simply seeing Kennedy. He seemed to embody the youthful idealism he encouraged and indeed helped generate. I forgot what he said at the groundbreaking, or would have had I not become a historian and revisited his remarks subsequently. Nor did I have any access to the main event, which took place inside the college athletic center, the Cage as it was known. Seating was limited to Amherst students, faculty, staff, alumni, and various dignitaries. Kennedy gave the last major speech of his life that day. He talked about poetry and power and the responsibility of artists to challenge received wisdom, no matter what the stakes. It is now considered one of his finest orations. 3 weeks later, he was dead. I have written at length about President Kennedy's assassination, and I won't revisit the subject here, except to state the obvious. It was a heartbreaking experience. The grief was profound, widely shared across the nation, and ingrained into memory by the nonstop television coverage of his death and state funeral. One of the thousands of condolence letters I read later captured the prevailing sentiment perfectly. The coffin was very small to contain so much of so many Americans, that written by a 13-year-old. My mother told me many years later that my father had cried over the death of President Kennedy. He felt, he said, as if he had lost one of his own brothers. The proximity of Kennedy's death to the president's visit to Amherst made it especially shocking, I think, from a child's vantage point. My parents' grief was apparent. I noticed they took less interest in the nightly news, especially as the grim march of the 1960s unfolded. The escalation of the war in Vietnam, which of course I would later understand Kennedy had played a part in, dominated the airwaves. My father both disapproved of the war and took umbrage at the protests against it. It was a tortured time for our country. My brother was nearing draft age, and it was something to hear my World War II veteran father express his view that this was a bad war, and he did not want my brother to fight in it. In 1968, as a high school student, I became an avid enthusiast of Bobby Kennedy and followed his brief campaign for the presidency with great excitement. My parents would have voted for him had he secured the Democratic nomination, but their affection for JFK was not transferable. That part of life was over. An era had ended. The story I have just told you undoubtedly played a part in my growing interest in history. Even at a fairly young age, I found comfort in the past. When I was worried or upset, I often retreated to a remote room in our local library in Amherst, where I would lose myself turning over the pages of the giant old bound volumes of Life magazine. My grandmother's presence in our home during my early childhood, I know, played a part in this. I missed her, and looking back was, in some sense, a response to her absence. I also developed fairly early an awareness of how quickly an unanticipated event could turn a secure world upside down. This troubled and interested me simultaneously. In any case, by the time I went to college, the die was cast. I studied history as a major and decided when I graduated to enter a PhD program in the subject. Although I wound up specializing in modern American history, that did not lead to a scholarly encounter with President Kennedy until much later. When I was a graduate student in the mid to late 1970s, our readings courses in modern American history ended with the New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt. The history we graduate students had lived, and that was drawing us to the discipline, our professors considered current events. As a pastime, I read the books on President Kennedy that began to flood the marketplace not long after his death. The first wave, many written by members of his administration, were mostly hagiographic. Paradoxically, the callousness of academic history and the impassioned radical politics that captured my attention as a graduate student had the same effect. They drove a spike into the heart of my sentimental view of JFK. I came to understand the nature of the American presidency and the history of the post-war period with a much greater degree of sophistication. Kennedy was a cold warrior, I now could see, who subscribed to the prevailing assumptions that had guided American intervention into Southeast Asia. As the disastrous nature of the war in Vietnam became increasingly apparent, the history clearly traced the early widening of the US commitment to JFK's administration. He had held the line at sending combat troops. Nonetheless, he had greatly expanded the American presence by deploying thousands of military advisors on the ground. Furthermore, responsibility for the 1963 coup d'etat that overthrew the American-backed government of South Vietnam and that resulted in the assassination of President Diem rested on Kennedy's shoulders, and he knew it. As a belatedly released private memo he dictated in the final weeks of his life would later vividly reveal. He only outlived Diem by a couple of weeks. Vietnam was just one issue. The list went on and on. The Cuban Missile Crisis that had highlighted Kennedy's coolness under pressure and his adroit handling of his Soviet counterpart also turned out to have a much more complicated backdrop. CIA plots to depose Fidel Castro, hatched during Kennedy's administration, had encouraged Castro to welcome Soviet offensive missiles on the island of Cuba. President Kennedy's slow response to the greatest moral challenge of his era, the abhorrent reality of racial segregation and the ongoing battle against it, also drew appropriate criticism from revisionist historians. JFK and his brother, Robert Kennedy, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, hewed closely to what Victor Navatsky called the Code of the Ivy League Gentleman. They believed that painstaking action through the courts and private negotiations with white Southern politicians was the safest way to advance, safest politically and otherwise, to advance desegregation. But a roiling and powerful civil rights movement around them repeatedly challenged their assumptions. Ultimately, that movement, its leaders, and the entrenched racism that fueled resistance to desegregation forced the Kennedy brothers towards more decisive action. In the interim, civil rights activists were beaten and even killed before Kennedy exerted the leadership he was repeatedly called upon to demonstrate. By the time I secured my first academic job in 1980, and I'm delighted to tell you that we won't be going through all of my academic jobs or you'd be here much longer. I'm nearing my end here. Kennedy was widely judged by most academic historians as a middling president at best. That assessment was not improved by revelations in the 1970s that Kennedy had recklessly pursued many sexual liaisons with women while serving as president. This information, though previously rumored, gained credibility amid the investigations of the House Committee on Assassinations. They turned up records that revealed visits to the White House by women who were not there to discuss policy issues with President Kennedy. Eventually, some of these women published their own firsthand accounts, including a young White House intern, half his age, with whom Kennedy remained in touch until nearly the time of his death. To say that these revelations were profoundly at odds with my idealized views of JFK would be an obvious understatement. His behavior was, in my view, shameful and repugnant. I struggled to put all these pieces together and to make sense of a man I had once seen as a heroic figure. As I grew older, learned more, and came to understand better both the history of our times and the nature of the human condition, I thought often about President Kennedy. My mother had been suggesting ever since I enrolled in graduate school that I should write a book about him. Stupidly, I dismissed this idea peremptorily. I felt then that I had far more weighty historical matters to ponder. Yet at midlife, as I looked back over the history I had lived and learned, I began to think more about the ways in which these two elements of my experience were joined. The growing conservatism apparent in our national politics, as well as the rampant cynicism and harsh visions fanned by political leaders, including some of our modern presidents, increasingly defined our country. In this context, the liberal idealism that Kennedy gave voice to in the early 1960s, however imperfectly realized, struck me as worth revisiting. I thought about writing a book on the evolution of liberalism, and in that pursuit, I made a research trip to the Kennedy Library. I was looking for source material that might reveal how Americans saw Kennedy in his own time, as opposed to our time. And it occurred to me that the condolence mail that poured in after his assassination might be illuminating. As I began to read these letters, I felt as if I were looking at the beating heart of the nation. It turned out that Americans, and indeed citizens from country around the world, saw something in the aims, determination, and eloquence of this young president who had touched their imaginations. Individuals of disparate backgrounds, religions, age, and political persuasions describe the ways in which Kennedy's vision for the United States and the world had lifted their hopes and enlarged their sense of possibility. I began to see that my family's response to Kennedy had perhaps less to do with our shared heritage as Irish Americans than with this larger phenomenon. For it was especially striking to read in letter after letter how many Americans of such wildly divergent origins identified with Kennedy. And this is my favorite picture of Kennedy, actually, with this coal miner in West Virginia, who you can see has lost an arm. He's got his Coke bottle stuffed here under his stump. And the look of recognition, perhaps he lost that arm in the Second World War rather than a mining accident. You look at Kennedy, perfectly groomed, shaking this grimy hand, and the look of recognition between these two men. From impoverished coal miners in West Virginia to African Americans who confronted racism daily in the rural South and in the northern inner cities, from college students to octogenarians, a common refrain echoed. Kennedy understood their plight, many said, and they drew inspiration from him. Even those who objected to Kennedy's liberal agenda generally did not doubt his sincerity. To be sure, Kennedy's violent death while in office and at such a young age contributed to these sentiments. Yet as the half-century since his death has passed, and the pendulum has swung from excessive mythologizing to stern criticism, historical assessment of his presidency has also shifted back to the center. A latecomer to civil rights, Kennedy introduced the most important civil rights bill since Reconstruction. He was also the first president in American history to condemn racial segregation in our society as a moral wrong. His aim of advancing health care for the aged was not fulfilled during his lifetime, but it reached fruition when Medicare was passed during Lyndon Johnson's administration. His Cold War adventurism continues to be examined by contemporary historians who note JFK's skepticism about employing American military might to solve global problems. At the time of his death, he was most proud of the nuclear test ban treaty he had managed to get through Congress. He warned of the sword of Damocles that such weapons represented and the peril they held for all of humanity. His personal conduct is certainly not mitigated by his public record on behalf of women, though it does reveal the paradoxes of his presidency. He sponsored and signed into law the first Equal Pay Act for American women, appointed the first presidential commission on the status of women, and issued the first executive order banning discrimination against women in the federal system. He was influenced by labor feminists, Kennedy's other women, I call them, who were rarely discussed, including Esther Peterson, whom he appointed as Assistant Secretary of Labor. The debate on JFK will continue, I have no doubt. Was the glass half full or half empty? My own verdict is one best expressed by a condolence letter I read at the Kennedy Library that concluded, "A man like this comes along once in a century." Kennedy's gift lay in his capacity to embolden so many in the country he led to seek that better world he suggested lay ahead. In so doing, he became something greater than himself. In 1961, as freedom riders sought to desegregate bus terminals in the South, only to be viciously attacked, Kennedy asked his civil rights advisor, Harris Wofford, with evident frustration, "Where are they getting these ideas?" He meant the demonstrators. And Wofford replied, "From you, Mr. President." Wofford knew, of course, that the civil rights activists charted their own course. But he wanted Kennedy to understand the ripple effects of his summons to young Americans to serve and change their country. This brings me full circle and to the end of my story. Last summer, a documentary filmmaker reached out to me to be interviewed for a film in production about Kennedy's 1963 visit to Amherst College. It's called The Last Speech, and it will be shown in June on public television. It focuses on several Amherst College students from this class of 1963 who also saw JFK that day way back in October and who answered Kennedy's exhortation to place their privileged education in the service of social betterment. They see their lives' work as derived from the day when Kennedy came calling in Amherst. As I look back, I too see Kennedy's impact on my own life, as have so many others who remember his presidency. It is perhaps a mark of maturity that I am less interested in moral judgments than in human and historical understanding. I've had the privilege of teaching a seminar on JFK to our history majors. As the students learn about Kennedy from his youth forward, they are captivated and puzzled. Was he the consummate cold warrior, or the president whose personal experience of the horrors of warfare led him to draw the line at deepening American military engagement in Southeast Asia? Did he see civil rights as an inconvenience he was forced to deal with, or, belatedly, as the revolution at hand that must be addressed even at the cost of his presidency? Was he the apparently devoted father who loved his wife and family, or the faithless husband and reckless Lothario who jeopardized his presidency to pursue private pleasure? Now that I'm at my current age, I'm able to suggest a radical idea to my students that I would never have been able to even consider when I was 21 years old. Perhaps he was both. And therein lies his and our story. Despite his human and political failings, Kennedy inspired many in this nation in ways uncommon among our presidents. It is a lasting legacy, or at least that is what I take away from the history I have lived and learned. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. This should be my swan song. Heidi, this should be my retirement talk, but it isn't.
5 o'clock, but if it's okay, we can take a couple of questions, and then we can kind of break up for some more informal chatting and so on. I have a microphone here. If somebody would like to ask a question, just raise your hand, and I can play talk show host.
Here's someone over here.
I wonder if you could make a few comments about Beto O'Rourke, the fellow taking on Ted Cruz in Texas. I saw him on the Bill Maher show recently, and certainly, from all appearances, seemed to be more of the Kennedy ideal than Kennedy actually was. I'd be interested.
Well, I think that you know, the thing about Kennedy was that he occupied an absolutely unique moment in American political history when television became an important force in American politics, and we got to see live, or often, our candidates. And yet, in this infant stage of television journalism, and in the pre-Watergate, pre-heightened Vietnam era, the investigative journalism that we have today, and certainly the 24-hour, 7-day-a-week cable news cycle that we're in, was not a part of the picture. So Kennedy, as our first television president, had all of the benefits and none of the negatives of mass media. And I myself feel, although many people felt tremendous affection for President Obama, and as I wrote this talk, I thought about African Americans all over this country, whatever their political views, and the pride that many felt when Obama was elected. And certainly all of us should have celebrated the overcoming of this horrific scourge in our society, at least briefly. And, but I think that part of the power of Kennedy was in that unusual moment. And I'm not sure that any president, I hope to be proved wrong as I often am, will ever have that sort of magical combination of things. So yes, he's an impressive young man, and there are others, women, like him out there, and we all hope for the best. Liz.
I wanted to ask you about your philosophy of history, because in your presentation, the pride of place is to memory and identity and what we would call meaning, or the subjective in history. And the objective, or when you have two places in the talk where you talk about interpretations, but they're basically just to kind of either buff up or bring down the nature of meaning. So what do you give more weight to a kind of an objective, interpretive history, or is it simply to you helpful in what you think is the more important goal of history, that is to understand how people generate meaning in relation to events? It's a curious question, but to me, because only, I would say, in the last two books that I wrote was I interested in the latter question. And so really for the first 30 plus years of my life,
as an academic historian slogging away in the vineyards of professional academic history, I feel as if it was much more this, what you're referring to as objective story and not about memory. Certainly for the occasion of this talk, I've never given a talk like this before. I've never told anybody, other than a selected few who were too polite to, were in no position to throw me out, my own story. So I feel, as the sun sets on the umpire, as it were, and on me, that I am drawn more often to thinking about history as memory. But luckily I have these brilliant colleagues who are dedicated to the former version of the discipline. My appetite for it has waned.
Other questions?
Thank you so very much for your talk. I'm edified on so many levels. Thank you for sharing. I want to sort of maybe replay to the best of my ability 3 things that really resonated with me, and they were more sentiments, but it's really a variation on a question that I would just ask anyone in these days and times. It's just sort of my stock question. But finding comfort in the past, the history of our times and the nature of our human condition, and then literary texts as a beating heart of the nation. When I put those 3 together, they make a profound impact on me because I'm a literary scholar, but I've often seen history as our disciplinary twin. And so all of this is just a way of asking, in these days and times with the sun setting, what is the enduring value of historians in relationship to colleges of liberal arts the world over in these trying times?
It's a wonderful question, and I have to tell you, I'm doing my bit, every Monday and Wednesday, and on other days in between in preparation, trying to teach our students first about the absolute personal pleasure to be derived in studying history, and the way that it can enrich one's own personal life and make you feel that there's a bigger meaning to our essential tragic condition as human beings, the fleeting nature of our own existence, and the many great challenges that we face personally. So on that level, I think it enriches life, and I try to convey that to my students, hence Liz's question. In terms of, I had a student in my office just the other day who was trying to decide between history and some lesser major. And they were interested in science, and they were interested in all kinds of other things. And I said, you can do all of those. The only thing you have to, it just has to have happened yesterday or earlier. And you can study all of that within the context of it. But I must say, I am very, very, very concerned about the degree to which our own memory, how the widespread ignorance of American history, which today is coming from the top, and whatever one's political views. Our president is not learned about the American past. He may have other virtues. And Kennedy really had a great interest in history. As many presidents have, you didn't have to be an intellectual. They were interested because they were in this situation. But it's not just the president, it's throughout our society. And also the way in which I hear daily when I turn on the news, the phrase, never before in American history has X happened. Well, 10 out of 10 times that's wrong. almost everything has happened before. Not everything, but almost everything. And so I really feel a tremendous duty is upon all of us to combat this in every way we can. And university professors, of course, are in a good position to do that, but it must become absolutely, I think, conveyed to the youngest among us about how important it is to know who we are as a country, because the United States is a tremendously diverse nation, becoming more diverse all the time. And there are certain things that hold us together as a nation, as a republic. And if we don't know, the founders, I think I'm right, Lige, believed that a virtuous citizenry was essential to the success of a democracy. And part of virtue is human understanding and knowledge. So this is all very, very important to what we need to do, I think, Reggie. So thank you for the praise. I try to live up to this, but I don't know how well I'm doing it.
What I would suggest, mindful of the time, is that those of you who are able, please stay and join us for reception. You can pelt Dr. Fitzpatrick with your other questions you may have, but would you join me one more time in thanking her for this wonderful talk?